Muchas gracias, muy buenas tardes. Es un gusto para mí estar aquí con todas y todos ustedes para tener el placer de escuchar a Joanna Erdman en un tema tan importante y constituye, creemos, el núcleo central de este encuentro, de esta conferencia latinoamericana sobre derechos reproductivos, que es precisamente el tema que ha anunciado George, es decir, las intersecciones entre la violencia contra la mujer y los derechos sexuales y reproductivos. Joanna Erdman es docente, además es catedrática en Derecho a la Salud y Política por la Facultad de Derecho de Surrey de la Universidad de Dalhousie, Nueva Escocia, Canadá. Su área de investigación principal es la salud sexual y reproductiva en un contexto transnacional. Joanna también ha actuado como parte coadyuvante ante varias cortes y organismos internacionales, incluyendo el Tribunal Europeo de Derechos Humanos, el Comité para la Eliminación de toda forma de discriminación contra la mujer y el Comité contra la Tortura. También codirige el Grupo Asesor sobre Cuestiones de Género del Departamento de Salud Reproductiva e Investigación de la Organización Mundial de la Salud y es integrante del Consejo Consultivo del Programa de Salud Pública y el Programa de Derechos de las Mujeres del Open Society Foundation. Es licenciada en Derecho y doctora en Derecho por la Universidad de Toronto, con maestría otorgada por la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Dalhousie. Sin más preámbulo, Joanna va a tener 13 minutos para hacer su disertación sobre violencia contra la mujer y las intersecciones con los derechos reproductivos. Joanna.
I was tasked today to speak to our general theme, to ask the question, what are the connections between freedom from violence and reproductive justice? Let me begin by acknowledging the importance of this question. Internationally, our focus has long been on securing rights of access and agency, repealing criminal laws and guaranteeing access to lawful services, ensuring access to skilled birth attendants and emergency obstetric care, and ensuring a range of contraceptive methods are available in the public system without discrimination. But in our advocacy, perhaps we pay too little attention to the ways in which restrictive laws subject people to violence, force them into precarious and desperate situations without the protection of law only with its threat. As reproductive rights advocates, we pay too little attention to how this threat, even if people survive it, is itself a violation of human rights. We pay too little attention to the ways in which health systems, which we work so hard to make accessible, are often themselves sites of violence. And last, even as we work desperately to meet people's needs for reproductive health care, contraceptive and abortion services, especially for the most marginalized groups, we not always ask or acted upon what drives these needs. Why are some people at greater risk of unwanted pregnancy or less able to cope with the consequences of it? Why do people not otherwise access available services? Why do people feel compelled to prevent or terminate a pregnancy when they desperately want to carry and have a child? What are the causes of these life?
This will be the structure of my presentation. And my point in acknowledging these three forms of violence will be to offer a way forward, to offer an agenda for reproductive justice with freedom from violence at its core. My first theme, violence in law. Last year, we submitted a brief to a human rights committee It argued that criminal laws violate the right to be free from torture and other forms of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. This was a striking claim because this right has traditionally been restricted to formal contexts of state interrogation, detention, and punishment. And as such, it's neglected many forms of state-inflicted gender-based violence. It's true that some human rights authorities have applied a violence framework to criminal abortion laws. They've interpreted unsafe abortion as a form of violence, and so declared government failure to reform criminal laws that drive unsafe abortion as a human rights violation. But human rights authorities have been less willing to see the inherently violent character of criminal abortion laws. The violence inherent in the state seizing control of a person's body and their capacity to reproduce, and enlisting the full subjectivity of the person in service of the state. After all, to gestate and to birth a child is a profoundly human act. It enlists the whole of a person and their full faculties of mind and body. It's an act that carries consequences for a person's life and their security, influencing the way they see themselves and their relationships to others and to society. To reproduce or not is thus an act of conscience, and to use state force to compel or constrain acts of conscience is repugnant to basic human dignity at the core of human rights. But why is this violence of criminal abortion laws so rarely seen in human rights law? We argued it's because dominant gender norms serve to minimize the inflicted pain and suffering of pregnancy and birth, to rationalize reproductive harm as no harm at all. Pregnancy, it's true, can't be simply analogized to the physical injury of a beating or a burn. It's a process and outcome desired by many and always involving some degree of bodily discomfort, distress, and pain. But the ease and comfort, even the celebration of pregnancy in our political and legal cultures blinds us to its burdens, naturalizes its sacrifices. The forcible conscription of a person's mind and body is disappeared, buried in what is seen as natural to a woman's physiology and social roles. This, then, is the point of reading criminalization as a form of torture or ill treatment, to make blind the violence that it inflicts, to lay bare the destruction of personality, the conscription of conscience, the violence inherent in the act of criminalization. And it is to be unapologetic and plain in this violence. It is to show that reproductive rights are not only health rights, they are fundamental civil and political rights. They are the preconditions of women's full and equal citizenship. At the most fundamental level, what it is to be treated as a person. And as such, reproductive rights are the prerequisites of an open and democratic state. My second theme, violence in healthcare. The global community has increasingly focused its attention on the widespread violence against women during labor and delivery in facility settings. physical and verbal abuse, neglect and abandonment, humiliation and punishment, coerced or forced care. In the abortion context, such treatment, unfortunately, has long been the subject of international concern. Coerced confessions through denied care, denunciations by providers to state authorities. But in 2011, for the first time in international law, a state was held responsible for the preventable death of a woman during childbirth. The Aline case involved a poor Afro-Brazilian woman who died from obstetric complications while seeking care in multiple health facilities. The human rights analysis in the case focused on the indignity of this neglect, of being forced to travel hospital to hospital in search of care, only to be left to die in indifference, unattended, in a hospital hallway. This is a form of institutional violence, because to speak of violence in a health facility is not merely to locate the place of mistreatment. It is also to identify the set of norms, the hierarchies, the conventions through which such violence is rationalized. This is why mere legal sanction rarely dislodges institutional violence. Legal rules are read through and subordinated to medical authority. The Special Rapporteur on Torture recognized this unique challenge of stopping violence in health facilities, noting the routine defense of brutal conduct on grounds of medical need or authority. Many providers regard themselves as entitled, even obligated, to use harmful practices to ensure healthy deliveries. But many of these practices, like routine episiotomies, are clinically unnecessary. They're based in tradition, not evidence, practiced for provider preference, not patient benefit. But medical authority obscures this fact, and so fosters a culture of impunity, where violence is not only unremedied, it is unnoticed. This, then, is the value of human rights in maternal care. Not to dismiss biomedical authority, but to challenge it. Human rights are measures of accountability. They open closed institutions like medicine, and they challenge the entrenched hierarchies of power. Human rights empower patients within these settings, privileges their voices, their sense of injustice, and their claims to be treated differently, to be treated better. And for this reason, it's critical in our human rights work that we not empower abstract norms of international law, but that we empower people themselves. That we start our work from where women live and labor, and we give meaning to human rights norms through people's experiences and through their own articulations of harm and justice. And so our authority to speak in reproductive justice must begin and must end not with the standards of science or law, but with the justice claims of people themselves. Yet we must also be careful not to so individualize reproductive violence that we lose its systemic dimensions, that we strip an act, an experience, of its larger context, and so of the structural forces that define it and give it meaning. If human rights advocacy is focused on a single act, a single victim, and a single perpetrator, we risk missing the structural injustices that breed that violence, obscuring its political, economic, and social origins. And so this leads to my third theme, violence in life. In our human rights advocacy, we must have the capacity to step back from the local setting of reproductive violence and to ask about the broader power dynamics that sustain it, that give it meaning, and that make it a regular rather than an exceptional event in our lives. We must have the capacity to draw the link between individual actions and historical conditions, to see the systemic and the material basis for reproductive violence. That it is at its core a part of the legacy and reality of the exploitation, domination, and dispossession of women and other marginalized groups under our unjust socioeconomic arrangements. But sometimes human rights preclude us from doing this work. And that is because human rights speak in a language of individual empowerment. That when individuals have access and agency, they can protect themselves and they can define for themselves the lives they wish to lead. This, of course, was the mark of global feminist movements in the 1990s, which challenged the view of women as passive targets of reproductive health programs and asserted that women as rights holders were entitled to decide freely the number, spacing, and number, timing, and spacing of their children, and to have the information, the education, and the means to do so. But we must be cautious of a language of individual empowerment, of a language of access and agency in conditions that preclude their meaningful exercise. After all, how do we ensure agency in reproductive health when so many women's lives remain quasi-feudal? When to support themselves and their families, they must enter relations of economic dependence and so become vulnerable to violence in the home. Where because of the exclusion and exploitation of women in the labor market, they must work under precarious and informal conditions, again, making them vulnerable to violence in work. Or where women live lives of endemic poverty, racism, and violence, such that contraception or termination of pregnancy seems their only choice, even where they would so desire otherwise. In such circumstances, agency is a weak expression of what these women exercise, for their choice is the only choice they can make. Moreover, agency is a language that threatens to legitimate the conditions of violence in which people live. It may relieve the state of responsibility for those conditions and so prevent collective action to change them. Like so many other fields of human rights, we must be careful that a language of individual access and agency does not depoliticize the causes and consequences of reproductive violence. We must resist focusing exclusively on the individual and ignoring the structures, the historical, the political, and the social circumstances that condition the meaningful exercise of those rights. This is the strength, I believe, lies behind the shift in language we see in maternal rights advocacy in this region, the shift in a language to obstetric violence. It's a language that expressly situates mistreatment in childbirth within a generalized pattern of social violence and inequality. It links the mistreatment of women in maternity care to their mistreatment in society at large, in the home, in the streets, in school. And by drawing a connection between obstetric violence and violence in the realms of other everyday life, this language offers us, as reproductive justice advocates, a way to connect with larger social justice movements that are seeking state accountability and systemic change. It uses human rights to lead us toward and not away from political empowerment and collective action. And so this then is my conclusion. A way forward. While human rights of access and agency may serve many ends, they fail at others, and they need to be supplanted by new frameworks and new modes of activism. This was true in the US context when women of color demanded reproductive justice and not access and agency. And it is also true in the international human rights context. Let us place freedom from violence at the center of our reproductive justice agenda. Let us advocate not only for rights of access and agency in the healthcare context, but for political rights to participate as full and equal members of our communities. That is, the right to engage in political life, for economic rights to secure livelihoods and resources, that is, rights to earn a living and to own and control property of our own, and for social rights to enjoy our sexualities and to live free of violence. Let us design a reproductive justice agenda that links reproduction to our social, our political, and our economic lives. And let these be the human rights of our reproductive agenda for the future. Thank you.
Creo que todas y todos estamos muy contentos con esta presentación magistral que nos ha disertado Joanna Erdman. Mientras van llegando las preguntas, simplemente como para reforzar algunos elementos desafiantes que nos ha planteado para la agenda. Al escucharla, recordaba mucho las enseñanzas de profesoras como Alda Facio, quienes nos planteaban la necesidad de interpretar y analizar las normas, teniendo en cuenta no solamente el contenido de la propia norma, sino también la estructura donde esta norma se desarrolla, pero sobre todo donde esta norma se implementa. Y Joanna ha llamado muy bien nuestra atención respecto de cómo la criminalización del aborto constituye también una forma de violación de los derechos humanos, una forma de violencia en contra de las mujeres, y por lo tanto se requiere que los estados revisen sus normas criminalizadoras del aborto y planteen políticas públicas que sirvan, que tengan como consecuencia la implementación de servicios que garanticen que las mujeres puedan acceder a abortos seguros. No sé si tenemos alguna pregunta que ya esté llegando, por favor. Tenemos poco tiempo para el diálogo, sin embargo, creo que tenemos que aprovechar al máximo la presencia de Joanna esta tarde para que nos ayude a aclarar algunos puntos. Aquí viene una pregunta en inglés. How do you think white feminists affect new obstetric violence is seen around the world? Entonces nos están preguntando cómo afecta, ¿no?, la violencia obstétrica
alrededor del mundo. Y para que puedas completar, voy a levantar las dos preguntas de repente, o primero hacemos un diálogo. ¿Tienes un micrófono, por favor? Y luego vemos la segunda pregunta.
Thank you. The question was, how do you think white feminism affects how obstetric violence is seen around the world? I think it's an excellent question, and the social science research on obstetric violence shows something quite interesting. For example, traditionally, the understanding of vaginal examinations without consent was understood as a violation of autonomy rights, that the person didn't have the right to have made a decision prior to the intervention being conducted. But social science evidence showed that this wasn't the only sense of violation that women had. In fact, in places where you have very strong gender norms around women and their bodies, it was also the idea of being on display in the medical setting where so many people were looking at your body and touching your body, and it was a sense of a violation of privacy, of dignity, as much as autonomy. And I think only by focusing on how women themselves in different settings and with different norms felt in light of the behavior could you understand the sense of violation and address it. And so that's my sense of developing a human rights and advocacy agenda by starting with women's lives and their own articulations of harm, and building up to norms in light of that, rather than working the other way around, and starting with human rights norms and trying to apply them to the situation. Better that we start from the ground and people's realities than to apply from a place of law and try to colonize the experience with legal norms.
Perfecto, y tenemos una segunda pregunta vinculada precisamente a las mujeres con discapacidad y su consentimiento y toma de decisiones como un reto permanente.
Yes, another great question about how to advocate for the agency of women who live with disabilities. I think an issue here is to recognize autonomy is not all or nothing. You know, and too often we have that absolute standard of autonomy. Many people, and I would say people both living with disabilities and people who do not, often need support and care in their decision making. And that this is not something that we should regard as a vulnerability or a weakness, but in fact is something to which everyone exercises their autonomy, often through and with the support of others. And so, how can we start thinking differently about our human rights, where we acknowledge that relational aspect of people's lives? I think people living with disability know that so well, and they would be able to, the disability rights movement, assist us to understand what it means to live lives with agency and dignity, but not necessarily requiring a meeting of agency or autonomy as set and with respect to another group. So really, again, thinking about how people live their lives in meaningful ways can guide us in our human rights work, rather than, again, working the other way around.
Muchas gracias. Creo que no tenemos ninguna otra pregunta. En todo caso, agradecerle a Joanna Erdman por su excelente disertación de esta tarde e irnos con un par de reflexiones. La primera, creo que es muy importante en la parte final de su presentación lo que nos dice Joanna respecto a no despolitizar las causas y consecuencias de la violencia reproductiva. Es fundamental trabajar sobre casos individuales, pero entendamos que los casos individuales son parte también de un conjunto de situaciones sistemáticas que violentan los derechos de las mujeres Y todo esto también es parte de una estructura institucional y, por tanto, los estados, quienes toman las decisiones políticas, están obligados a tomar acción para la protección integral de los derechos de las mujeres. Y en consecuencia, la segunda reflexión, tomando palabras que han sido citadas en la convocatoria de este evento, no se puede hablar de derechos humanos sin hablar de los derechos reproductivos. Y hoy la disertación de Joanna Erdman nos ha hecho ver y constatar y ratificarnos en que los derechos reproductivos no solo son derechos vinculados a la salud, sino también vinculados a los derechos civiles, políticos y económicos. Muchas gracias. Muy buenas tardes.